The day after, confirmation was provided that the United States was prepared to permit Ukraine, as it's described, to launch cross-border strikes on targets in pre-2014 Russia, so long as these are related to Russia's ongoing Kharkiv offensive. Well, there continues to be much commentary, a great deal of discussion, a lot of euphoric articles I've noticed in the Western media about this. Articles which, by the way, I think are disastrously ill-judged, but which tell us again how some people seem to want to see war taken to the ultimate point. Anyway, there's been a lot of commentary, a lot of discussion, though I have to say, I sometimes get the impression that some people don't quite understand what the public decision that the United States has actually made, in fact, is. I saw an article, for example, in the Daily Telegraph, which started talking about missile strikes using, amongst other weapons, ATACMS missiles against Russian air bases deep inside Russia. Well, the one weapon system that was specifically excluded from the permission given to Ukraine by the United States to use against targets in Russia yesterday was the ATACMS missile. And that, of course, to some extent, well, respects, at least for the moment, Russia's red line on this question. There's been also a great deal of speculation about the fact that France and Britain are not themselves necessarily part of this agreement. The announcement, the one made by the United States, it specifically is limited to the United States itself, and supposedly Britain and France can authorize or can allow Ukraine to conduct missile strikes on Russian facilities inside 2014 Russia, using presumably the Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles that have been used before. Well, again, that is possible, but the British themselves have made no such announcement up to this time, and nor, incidentally, has there been any public announcement by the French. And if we're talking about Zalinski, he was complaining yesterday that so far there has not been any 100% confirmation from the British that Storm Shadow missiles can be used in strikes against Russia. Of course, about 3 weeks ago, when David Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, suggested that such permission might be provided, the Russians reacted strongly, and the British ambassador was summoned to the foreign ministry in Moscow and given a dressing down, and the British made no public response, and coverage of that visit to the foreign ministry was all but non-existent in the media in London. And following David Cameron's comment, there have, at least at the moment, been no Storm Shadow missile strikes on pre-2014 Russian territory from Ukraine. I think I am going to make one observation, one practical observation about the announcement which was made yesterday. One which I notice a lot of commentators, especially a lot of media commentators in the West, don't appear to acknowledge. Some of these commentaries talk about using HIMARS missiles fired from HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems for strikes inside Russia, and they draw all sorts of pictures of what targets could be reached from HIMARS launchers operating in the Kharkiv area and along the Russian border. There's also references to the small diameter bomb, which is also launched from the HIMARS launcher and which has a longer range than the actual missiles that this launcher uses. And all kinds of claims and comments are made on the basis of the use of these weapons. But of course, we've had now extensive commentary that tells us that these weapon systems, the HIMARS missiles and the small diameter bombs, have been rendered in effect largely ineffectual by Russian jamming. And again, a few do from time to time get through, though apparently their accuracy has been very, very substantially degraded. There's been an ongoing battle between the Americans and the Russians in the electronic warfare area. It is universally acknowledged that the Russians are way ahead and seem to be moving further ahead still. And, well, one way or the other, it's questionable, or at least to me it is questionable, that launching HIMARS missiles from HIMARS launchers or launching small diameter bombs from HIMARS launchers in the Kharkiv area is going to be any more effective than it is anywhere else on the battlefronts in Ukraine. Presumably, Russian jamming in the Kharkiv area and elsewhere along the Russian border will be as intense and as dense as always. Further and beyond this, as I discussed extensively yesterday, the lifespan of launcher systems, or indeed of any kind of large vehicle deployed close to the border, appears to be extremely short. The Russians have overwhelming aerial dominance over this area. They've saturated the sky with drones. It's likely that this will intensify. So I would have thought, again, that deploying HIMARS launch vehicles to this particular area is likely to result in significant losses of these launchers, rather than in any significant damage being done to Russian positions. As for the Storm Shadows are, of course, air-launched missiles, and the same applies to the Scalps, the French Scalp missiles, which are very similar. Now, these missiles apparently have ranges of around 250 to 300 kilometers. In other words, in order to launch strikes deep into Russia, the Sukhoi-24 bombers that Ukraine operates and which launch these missiles would also have to approach Russian territory, presumably traveling over Kharkiv or the Black Sea or somewhere like that, in order to launch these missiles. That would make them very visible, I would have thought, to Russian radar systems, and, well, it would reduce significantly the chances of survival of these aircraft, which are said to be in very, very short supply indeed. I've read variously that the number of Sukhoi-24s, operational Sukhoi-24s, still in Ukrainian service is in the low single digits. So this might not be such a good idea. Possibly, conceivably, sometime in the autumn, when the F-16s appear, if they are adapted to launch the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, which perhaps they will be, they will take over and they will be the aircraft that will approach Russian territory and carry out the aerial strikes using these missiles against Russian positions inside Russia. And, well, some of the comments made by some NATO leaders, people from Denmark, for example, people from the Netherlands, might imply that this is indeed the plan. But again, that brings the F-16s dangerously close, it seems to me, to the places where the Russian air defense system is at its most dense and where the Russian Air Force is at its most powerful. And once again, I would have thought that the survival chances of F-16s doing something like that would be rather thin indeed. I don't want to discount the seriousness of this situation. On the contrary, I believe it is very, very serious indeed and very dangerous. And as a result of this announcement, the United States and the NATO countries are on a slippery slope, which brings them closer to the point when they're going to have to make a decision whether or not to actually cross that Russian red line. And of course, if they do try, despite all the problems, to launch their Storm Shadows and their Scalp missiles from Ukrainian territory into Russia, then they will be crossing that red line, even though, as I have also pointed out at length, the actual record of the Storm Shadows and the Scalps in Ukraine is rather poor. So far, they have completely failed to achieve the dramatic results that I think many people expected that they would. So, it's a dangerous situation, but one should not, I think, overlook the fact that there is a fundamental difference between the Storm Shadows and the Scalps and the kind of missiles that and the ATACMS, which are, I suspect, the missiles that the Russians are most worried about. The ATACMS missiles, unlike the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, are ground launched. They're launched from HIMARS launchers. They have a kind of ballistic trajectory. They're supersonic. They'd be more difficult for the Russians to intercept, or at least the Russians would have more difficulty shooting down the launcher systems, destroying the launcher systems, than they would aircraft launching air-launched missiles like the Storm Shadow and the Scalp. And I can see that they might potentially increase Russia's problems. Having said that, I'm also going to make a further observation about the ATACMS, which builds on commentaries that I've been making about it before. Over the course of a meeting of the defense ministers of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which he is attending in Almaty in Kazakhstan, the new Russian defense minister, Andrei Belousov, said that over the course of May, the Russians had shot down as many as 50 ATACMS missiles. And the Russian Defense Ministry has just claimed that Russia shot down 16 ATACMS missiles over the course of last week. So that is far and away the bulk of the ATACMS missiles that the Ukrainians, with the assistance of the United States, obviously, have launched. Every so often, an ATACMS missile has managed to get through and has done a certain amount of damage. Undoubtedly, some air defense facilities close to Crimean airfields have suffered actual damage from ATACMS missile strikes. But relative to the number of missiles that have been used and the expectations that existed around these missiles, I have to say that the effect of their use up to this time has, at least to me, been underwhelming. They have not made any fundamental difference to the situation on the battlefields. In fact, I'm not clear that they made any difference actually at all. And the day before yesterday, I think it was, there was an article in Military Watch magazine, one of these magazines that exist in such superabundance in the United States, which cover all kinds of military issues from all sorts of perspectives. But Military Watch magazine, which does seem to be a fairly well-informed magazine, there was a comment there that just as the Russian electronic warfare systems are successfully jamming the HIMARS missiles and the small diameter bombs, and by the way, the Excalibur shells, it's only a matter of time before they'll start to have some kind of effect on the ATACMS missiles as well. Now, I'm going to say straight away, I don't understand that. I understand that the ATACMS, like the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, does not use external inputs. I understand that the target for the ATACMS missile is studied before launch, and that the coordinates are programmed into the missile before it is launched, which would, as I said, logically, at least to me, make it jam-proof. I have seen suggestions that, even these kind of systems can be interfered with in some sort of way where there is an electronic warfare capability. I'm not going to make any pretense that I understand how it can be done. No doubt there will be people on the threads and in emails who will explain to me either that it cannot be done, or they will explain to me that it can be done, and they will explain how. But anyway, I don't pretend to know. But anyway, that is what Military Watch said. And one thing I do believe, which I think is true, and I remember reading it a few weeks ago in, again, one of these military publications that appears in the United States. This is that the usual time frame that it takes the Russians to understand and adjust to a Western weapon system when it is introduced on the battlefield in Ukraine is 6 weeks. That is the window that a system has. After 6 weeks, the Russians adapt to it. They understand how it works. They're able to modify their air defense capabilities or whatever other capabilities they need to modify in order to counter it. And thereafter, and from that point, the effectiveness of the Western system rapidly declines. Now, I think that is already turning out to be true with the ATACMS, and I expect that it will prove to be true also. Now, let me repeat once again, I don't want to suggest in making these observations that I am downplaying the significance of what NATO is and the United States are gradually edging towards. My point is a separate one, that in military terms, all of these decisions are not the magic answer to Ukraine's problems and are not going to transform the trajectory of the war. They will, however, escalate the general crisis, or they have the potential to escalate the general crisis between the United States and Russia to unacceptably high levels. As Putin pointed out at painstaking length in his press conference in Tashkent of a few days ago, missile strikes on Russian territory using Storm Shadows, Scalps, or ATACMS missiles can only take place with the full participation and involvement of Western militaries. If such attacks happen, Western militaries are participating in attacks against Russia. And that is an act of war. There is absolutely no doubt about that. From a point of view of international law, that is unequivocally so. I have seen that Western officials have tried to get round that by saying that for Ukraine to launch counterstrikes against Russia would be consistent with international law because Ukraine is in a conflict with Russia in which they claim that Russia is the aggressor. I think a case can be made that Ukrainian counterstrikes on Russian positions inside Russia would not violate international law. But we are not talking about, Putin is not talking about mere Ukrainian strikes, which have been happening continuously and all the time for well over a year now. What Putin is concerned about are strikes by Western militaries, involving the direct, active participation of Western militaries, and that is a wholly different matter. Now, there is perhaps one glimmer of a reason for thinking that maybe this situation might be controlled and that the worst might be avoided. And I say this taking the information from Putin's press conference in Tashkent. After discussing at extraordinary length the properties of the various Western missiles involved, the Storm Shadows, the Scalp missiles, and the ATACMS missiles, and explaining that they could not operate without the direct participation of Western militaries. After doing all of that, Putin suddenly and somewhat inexplicably veered off on a strange tangent, discussing the offensive in Kharkiv region, the Russian offensive in Kharkiv region. And in fact, this is what he said. The focus is on the developments on the outskirts of Kharkiv, but they were the ones to provoke those events. I made it clear publicly, I think it was 6 months ago, that if they continue to target residential neighborhoods, we will have to create a security area. Not long ago, we started doing what I said back then. First, they provoked us in Donbass. For 8 long years, they have been pulling the wool over our eyes and making us believe that they were going to resolve the issue peacefully, and eventually made us try to restore peace by using the armed forces. Then they deceived us during the negotiation process and decided that they would defeat us on the battlefield by inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. We warned them against making incursions into our territory, shelling Belgorod and neighboring areas, or else we will be forced to create a security area. Look at what your Western colleagues are reporting. No one is talking about shelling Belgorod or other adjacent territories. The only thing they're talking about is Russia opening a new front and attacking Kharkiv. Not a word. Why is that? They did it with their own hands. Well, let them reap the fruits of their own ingenuity. The same thing can happen in case the long-range precision weapons, which you asked about, is used. Now, that came out of nowhere, and it seemed, as I said, to be an odd tangent. Putin does often engage in tangents, and I suspect that this was one of them, but I also think it was fully intentional. And I think what it suggests is that there have in fact been discussions, private discussions, contacts about the American decision between the Americans and the Russians before the decision to announce the decision was made on Thursday in the late on Thursday in the United States. Putin is focusing here on the Russian offensive in Kharkiv. He's pointing out the reasons why that offensive took place. The United States has linked the decision to relax, as it says, its prohibition against using American weapons for strikes on Russian territory to the events in Kharkiv. And what Putin says in these comments is, well, look, this is actually absurd. You brought this on yourselves. You sat back, even as the Ukrainians were shelling Belgorod and other places inside Russia. And now you're talking about us having engaged in some kind of escalation, when on the contrary, it is an escalation you yourselves provoked. Now, what is interesting about these comments of Putin's is, of course, that he made them before the formal announcements, before the announcements that were made by the United States on Thursday and early Friday. So it looks as if Putin had been informed in advance that the US was going to make this decision and was going to link it to the events in Kharkiv. And it seems to me likely, or at least possible, that the US, that the Biden administration, to be precise, even as it was having discussions about what to do in response to Zelensky's increasingly hysterical demands for permission to strike facilities inside Russia, that on this occasion at least, on this one occasion at least, the Biden administration did one thing, which I have to say I think was both necessary and wise, which is contact the Russians and inform them of the kind of discussions that were taking place in Washington, and gauge the Russian reaction and find out directly from the Russians what the red line was, what the Russian red line was, and try to match the decision, the ultimate decision, accordingly. In which case, it is likely that the US, in effect, informed the Russians of what its decision was going to be before it informed the Ukrainians and the US's other NATO allies, all of whom, as I said, were kept guessing and coming up with all sorts of ideas and proposals right up to the moment when the decision was finally announced, and who seem to have been to some extent blindsided by the actual American announcement. Now, that is an encouraging sign. It suggests that for once the US is seeking some input from the Russians about its decisions. It might imply that some people in the Pentagon are becoming increasingly concerned about where all this is going, which I find entirely likely. It could be that General Brown, for example, has weighed in and has said, look, before we go ahead with this kind of thing, We need to find out what the Russians are going to say, because this situation is becoming dangerous and very risky. I'd like to think so. And perhaps Putin's words suggest it. At least they do suggest it to me. In fact, when you read his comments about the possibility of strikes by Western systems against Russian territory, they almost read as if he is specifically addressing the United States and is participating at some remote level in the American discussion. Consider, for example, these words also made over the course of his comments during the press conference. More broadly, this unending escalation can lead to serious consequences. If Europe were to face those serious consequences, what will the United States do, considering our strategic arms parity? That looks like a question addressed directly to the Americans. Well, that's a possible take on this discussion. I'm not going to pretend that I'm absolutely sure that a discussion between the Americans and the Russians has taken place over the course of the last week. I'm sure that the Russians, for their part, have been conveying their concerns in private in the strongest terms to the Americans. But whether the Americans have been paying any attention and whether they've been responding in the way that I interpret Putin's words to suggest, well, I get to say frankly, I don't know. And I accept also that maybe I'm interpreting these comments of Putin in this particular way, because I would like to believe that such a discussion over this extremely dangerous issue did indeed take place. As Putin says, time will tell. But notice something else, which is that he also says this. He's also saying this. He says that if there is an attempt to extend the battle zone by launching strikes deep inside Russia, well, that might be what causes the Russians to decide to expand their sanitary zone. And he makes the point that they let them reap the fruits of their own ingenuity. The same thing can happen in case the long-range precision weapons, which you asked about, is used. In other words, if the longer-range weapons are indeed used, putting aside the other consequences, which Putin was also talking about, one effect will be to cause the Russians to expand their sanitary zone even further. And as I discussed in my program, I think it was yesterday or maybe it was the day before, the Russians are already talking about a sanitary zone that extends all the way to Kiev itself and in fact incorporates Kiev within it. Now, on that specific topic, I would point out that I received a series of absolutely fascinating emails from a regular correspondent who's provided much invaluable information to me over many months now. And some time ago, this person actually suggested to me, on the strength of discussions he was aware of, which were taking place in Moscow, that in fact the Russians do in fact have actual plans to extend the sanitary zone all the way up to and including Kiev. And of course, it could be that that is what the movement of these 300,000 men to the border that the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Mr. Umerov, was talking about. Well, that might be what this is all about, and it could be what the eventual offensive, if it happens, in Sumy region is all about as well. So we'll see. Now, I'm going to make two further and I think final observations. The first observation is that the really big news over the last week is not that the United States is authorizing attacks on Russian territory by Ukraine. As I've repeatedly pointed out, attacks like that happen all the time and have been happening now for many months. As Putin correctly points out, it's precisely those attacks which explains why there is an ongoing battle in Kharkiv in the first place. If the United States does eventually decide to participate, that's the only correct word, in missile strikes against Russian territory, then that would be a dramatic escalation, but that's not the decision that's been made up to now. What is, in my opinion, the really big news is the final confirmation of what I have been saying for weeks now, which is that ever since the fall of Avdiivka, there has been an escalating, a steadily rising panic in Kiev and in Western capitals. And in Kiev, and specifically on the part of President Zalinski and his circle, this panic has now risen to the point of outright hysteria. But all Western governments, to a greater or lesser extent, are caught up in it, including, and most especially, European governments who believed at the outset of this crisis that Russia would be weakened and perhaps even broken up, or that there would be regime change there, and that the Russian problem that they've been nursing for 300 or 400 years would finally go away, and who are now terrified by the prospect that, on the contrary, this is going to end in a clear-cut Russian victory and the return of the Russian superpower right up to the borders of Europe itself, at a time when the United States is increasingly having to look across its shoulder at China and worry about the challenge that is coming there. So it's the panic, the confirmation of panic, and in effect, the decline in decision-making ability to the extent that it's ever existed in Kiev. The fact that Zelensky himself seems to be in a state which the Financial Times says one of his own officials described as paranoia. Others can use other words. Hysteria is one that springs to my mind. Tells us how frightened and alarmed by the overall military situation both he and other Ukrainian officials by now have become. And of course, what applies to Zelensky applies also to other Western governments as well, to the French government, to some extent to the German government. They're all responding to it in different ways. Italy seems to be now taking the first steps, tentative steps, to distance itself from the whole affair. France, on the contrary, the French government, President Macron, is becoming increasingly aggressive, as one senses that panic there also is starting to grow. Germany, uncertain how to respond. Britain also. But as I said, the panic is rising across Europe. It's very high now in Kiev, and the concern and perhaps even the panic is beginning to reach Washington as well. And as I've said, every panic, often broken by brief intervals of delusion and euphoria. We had one a couple of weeks ago when Congress finally passed the $61 billion aid package for Ukraine, which, incidentally, as we can see, is making no difference to the events on the battlefronts. I have seen absolutely no sign that the situation on the battlefronts has changed in any way since that $61 billion package was passed. We're always told that weapons and shells and things will start to arrive in larger quantities in Ukraine at some point over the next few weeks or months, and then the situation will change. But up to now, there's been no visible sign of this. Anyway, that's one sign of recovery, as I said, that happens. That's what happens. You get these moments of euphoria, but ultimately the euphoria quickly passes. The panic then returns, and it always returns at a higher level. We're going through another period of euphoria at the moment with the decision to authorize strikes on Russian territory. But before long, in a couple of days' time, it too will have ebbed away, and the situation will return to that panic that we have already seen. So that's one thing that I would say about this story. The second thing is that the big winner of the events of the last 2 weeks or so is none other than Vladimir Putin himself. He has now been given further proof, if any more were needed, that what he's been saying about the aggressive intentions of the West towards Russia is true. The United States, the Western powers, are now openly talking about participating in missile strikes on Russian territory. He has now ample grounds to say to the Russian people and to the wider world that my concerns about Ukraine were justified all along. See, it is in fact indeed being used as a launch pad for attacks on Russia, and the decision to launch the special military operation, therefore, was entirely justified and entirely correct. And of course, he understands this, and he is driving this point home continuously and all the time. That is the reason why he continuously turns back to the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022, which the West torpedoed, and why he also dwells on the previous history of attacks on Belgorod and Kursk region and the Ukrainian incursions, and also the West's obsession with inflicting a strategic defeat upon Russia. He's able to tell the Russian people, look, everything that I have told you about the West is true. They're actually planning now to launch missile strikes against us. They're discussing it with the Ukrainians. They're looking for ways to do that. They're not respecting our red lines. And of course, when Putin talks to officials of other countries in the global south, when he talks to MBS, when he talks to President Lula of Brazil, when he talks to Xi Jinping, or to Narendra Modi, or Cyril Ramaphosa, or any number of other leaders, he's got it all there. The case is being made for him. And politically he is winning. This is one reason, for example, why the peace conference, which is now confirmed, is due to take place in Lucerne, in Switzerland, and which Zelensky has been staking so much hope on, why that peace conference is now visibly collapsing, why there is such little enthusiasm around the world from non-aligned and global south countries in terms of their participating in it, because the Russians, Putin, are able to tell these countries, look, we're not really the aggressors at all in this matter. It's the West, ultimately, that has been engaged in this kind of aggression. It is the West which goes on in for endless, unending escalation. It is the West that is wanting to defeat us. It is the West that wants to attack us. It is the West that wants to break our country up. And as I said, his case is being made for him. Now, I have never understood why Western leaders, Western foreign ministries, Western journalists are so blind to this underlying political reality. And if it is indeed the Russian plan to march on Kiev and indeed to seize Kiev, well, politically, it is going to be far more easy now for them to do that. They have all sorts of grounds that they can produce justifying such a move, certainly much easier than it was back in February, March 2022, when much of the world was astonished when the Russians did cross the border and enter Ukraine. Anyway, there it is. I doubt that the West is going to change course. I see absolutely no sign that any of the myriad of commentators in the West, in the Western media, who constantly demand and insist on some further escalation, have any grasp of this political reality. But of course, Putin does, Lavrov does, the team around him do, and I think that this possibly explains one of the reasons why they are so calm and controlled about this affair, why they respond to these endless Western provocations in the way that they do, because they realize that ultimately, politically, where it ultimately matters, every provocation, every one of these provocations from the West, every one of these escalations from the West, ultimately plays to their advantage. Now, I want to move on, and I want, before I turn to the situation on the battlefronts, to talk about the Ukrainian attacks on the early warning radars inside Russia. And I've had a most interesting email from someone, and again, I have to be very careful not to discuss who this person is or to reveal anything about them. But suffice to say that this is somebody who does understand these things, which I, of course, do not. And his point is that the Russians have created, over the last few years, and specifically, I suspect, over the course of the special military operation, an AI-based integrated radar early warning system, which is able to function in real time and which is able to provide information, data, not just to the Kremlin now, but to Russian commanders involved in the conflict zone, specifically in Ukraine. And I understand that the Voronezh radar in Armavir, for example, as well as having general coverage over the Middle East, also has coverage over Crimea and over the launch positions of ATACMS missiles which have been launched towards Crimea. And the Russian air defense system is able to draw on this information, and the information that comes from this Voronezh radar in Armavir is one of the reasons why the ATACMS strikes on Crimea and in southern Russia, against positions in southern Russia, have proved overall to be so unsuccessful. For the record, I think that when ATACMS missiles have been able to penetrate Russian air defenses, it's possibly due to either one of two reasons: human error on the part of the Russian operators, who obviously are highly trained, but who also have to make decisions, split-second decisions, in real time, in very, very stressful conditions. That is one. And also, it is because sometimes the sheer volume of ATACMS missiles launched towards any particular target means that defense missiles, that there are simply not enough air defense missiles to cope with a volley, and the volley becomes overwhelmed. I ought to say that the key air defense missile, as I understand it, in intercepting the ATACMS missiles, contrary to some reports, is not so much the S-400 system, though that does play a very significant role, but rather the Tor point defense system, a short-range anti-aircraft and anti-missile system, which the Russians are deploying apparently in ever larger quantities. Anyway, the point is, it's not lack of radar coverage. It's not that the Russians are not fully informed whenever an ATACMS missile manages to get through, whenever an ATACMS missile rather is launched. And the Russians are fully informed about all ATACMS launches. As I said, it's these two other reasons which explain why from time to time the ATACMS are able to get through. And it looks as if the various Voronezh radars are playing a significant role in this. So the attack on the radar system in Armavir does actually, contrary to what I initially said, have some relevance to the course of the special military operation. It perhaps reflects frustration on the Ukrainian side about the failure of the ATACMS strikes. Much was expected of them. They're not having the effect that the Ukrainians imagined they would, and they appear to think that if they can somehow damage or even destroy the radar in Armavir, that will increase significantly the effectiveness of the ATACMS and the strikes that they have been trying to conduct in the Black Sea and in Crimea as well. Now, I've already said that my understanding is that the actual damage that these drone attacks did to the Voronezh radar was superficial. Apparently, both the radar and a nearby building were hit by a drone. The building may have been the building where the operators are based, but given that we're talking about a strategic facility, and knowing a fair amount now about how the Russians arrange these facilities, I strongly suspect that the radar operators actually operate from an underground bunker complex, probably beneath the building, and it's most unlikely, therefore, that the damage to the building itself, which again looks superficial, would have in any way materially affected their ability to conduct operations. As for the radar, from what I can understand, the sort of holes that some people are seeing in the radar are simply cladding. As I understand it, and I mean, I have to say I'm not 100% convinced, certain about this, but I have been given information to this effect. The actual operation of the radar has been unaffected. It has been able to continue operating at all times, despite this damage which was done. And the fact that there have been several Ukrainian attack and strikes on Crimea since the attack on the radar station in Armavir effectively confirms that, because all of those attack and strikes have failed. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this. I should explain that though the source provided me with the explanation about the integrated nature of the air defense system and the fact that the Armavir radar does have the ability to track ATACMS launches. Some of the other information that I've just discussed has come from a multiplicity of other sources, if I can use that euphemism. In other words, it's not just from one person. But as I said, I have to be very, very careful not to give away the identities of the people who write to me. Anyway, there we are. That's what I wanted to say about that. Now let's turn to the military situation, and another very, very, very bad day indeed yesterday for Ukraine. I've said in previous programs that the momentum, the Russian momentum, is growing. Well, after I said that, we had perhaps one or two quieter days, but yesterday things began to heat up again, and heat up in a very serious way. Firstly, there was another massive Russian missile strike over the course of last night, and this involved large multitudes of missiles. There's some suggestions that Kinjal missiles were used, but no confirmation of this, and some doubt it. But anyway, huge numbers of missiles, KH-101s, Calibres, other missiles of that kind, Iskander M missiles, ground-based ballistic missiles. Many types of missiles were launched. Lots of uranium drones were in the air as well, depleting the already fragmented Ukrainian air defenses in advance. Well, the strike all across Ukraine this time again appears to have been concentrated against the Ukrainian energy system. And apart from the remnants of the thermal energy system that was already massively damaged, apart from those attacks, it seems that a particular target also was a major storage area, underground storage area for natural gas, where in fact the European Union also apparently stores gas. And apparently it was built by the Soviets, and it is the biggest gas storage complex, certainly in Europe, and I've even suggested it might be in the world as a whole, though I suspect that by now the Russians will have built massive gas storage facilities in Russia itself. Anyway, this was a massive attack. The Ukrainians, as always, claimed that large numbers of missiles were shot down. What I would say is that we've had lots of reports of detonations and damage done to Ukrainian energy facilities. It is difficult to reconcile these claims of successful interceptions of missiles with the actual damage that the Russians appear to be doing to the energy system. And when the Russians attack military facilities which do not have a connection to civilians, it's perhaps easier for the Ukrainians to pretend or to claim that they've shot down most of the missiles. But of course, when it is the energy system itself that gets attacked, it's much more difficult for them to do that. And I suspect that that is the situation now. Anyway, there we are. A major Russian missile attack right across Ukraine. There was, by the way, also a obviously much smaller Ukrainian missile strike against Belgorod. Now, The Guardian today is reporting it, and it's giving the impression that this is the first response, the first attack of this nature that Ukraine is carrying out, and this is because of the decision by the United States to authorize cross-border strikes, which is an interesting claim. Of course, those of us who have followed the war know that there have been many, many strikes by Ukrainian forces, missile, rocket artillery and tube artillery against Belgorod, and that this has been an ongoing problem. And of course, it's what Putin alluded to in his press conference in Tashkent. The Russians claim that every single one of the rockets that was launched towards Belgorod was shot down and that no significant damage was therefore done. Well, we find out shortly whether or not that is true. What I would say about the attack on Belgorod is that it is, or so it seems to me, consistent with the way the Ukrainians respond to reverses on the battlefronts. They, especially if the reverses are happening close to Donetsk city, which they have been shelling continuously since 2014 until very recently, until Russian forces have, since the breakthrough in Avdiivka, started to push them back. And it is also similarly the same pattern, at least, is now starting to recur in Belgorod, as the Russians extend the size of their sanitary zone in Belgorod, in Kharkiv region. The Ukrainians respond by intensifying their rocket strikes on Belgorod city, as if to tell the Russians, well, you're not succeeding in what you're trying to do. So what exactly is happening in Kharkiv region? Well, there's been less news from Lipsy over the last couple of days. There's been suggestions that the fighting in Lipsy is in effect at an end, that the two sides are now heavily entrenched around Lipsy, that the Ukrainian counterattacks in this area have indeed been repulsed, but that the Russians are making no serious attempt for the moment to advance. I suspect that with the forces they have, the Russians, given the size of the forces that Ukraine has concentrated in this area, lack the means to break through in Lipsy, and for that reason, they've parked this particular battle, even as they concentrate on Volchansk, which I think remains for them the single most important battle of all. And the fighting in Volchansk remains incredibly intense. Now, 2 days ago, there were reports that the Russians had broken into the fortified area in northern Volchansk, where some Ukrainian soldiers are trying to hold out, stem the Russians. The bombing and shelling of this area, by the way, by the Russians is, again, on a terrifying scale. The trauma that the Ukrainian soldiers who are trying to fight in this area must be experiencing is simply off the scale. Nonetheless, there are reports that the Russians some days ago broke in and that fighting is taking place in this area itself. There's been some doubts about this. it's been suggested by several people that that the fact that the Russians are bombing various positions in this fortified area so intensely must mean that if the Russians did break in, they were driven out again, and that the entire area remains under Ukrainian control. The same thing has been repeatedly said about the micro-district to the east of the aqueduct in Chasov Yar. The Russians, some weeks ago, were reported to have captured buildings inside the micro-district in Chasov Yar, and the fact that the Russians bombing this micro-district intensively and shelling this district intensively has been treated by some people as evidence that this Russian attack must have failed and that the Russians pulled out. Well, I don't accept this. I don't think that this is. I think this is a non sequitur. I think we can say this confidently. It doesn't follow. In the fighting in Avdiivka, the Russians, as they stormed Avdiivka, also bombed Avdiivka on a scale even more intense than what we're seeing in Volchansk and Chasov Yar. And one of the things we discovered during the bombing of Avdiivka is that the Russians are able to conduct bombing like this with deadly accuracy, so that bombs can be dropped on Ukrainian positions that are only a few tens of meters away from Russian positions, and that the Russian military apparently has that capability, and it exercises it in Avdiivka, and I see absolutely no reason why it couldn't do the same thing in Chasov Yar and in Volchansk. In Chasov Yar, by the way, we have now received pictures, conclusive film, produced by the Ukrainians themselves, which confirm that there are indeed Russian troops, Russian positions in the micro-district east of the canal. So I think most likely, almost certainly, the Russians are indeed entrenched now within the citadel area, as some people are calling it, inside the micro-district, inside the citadel area, inside Volchansk. There's been a lot of claims about the terrifying losses that the Ukrainians are suffering in terms of supplies and armoured vehicles as they try to keep the forces in the area of Volchansk reinforced. Supposedly all the supplies have to move along a single road. The Russians are tracking this road continuously. The Russians are able to shell and bomb anything that moves along this road, causing terrible damage, and apparently around 300 confirmed Lancet strikes have taken place in this area, and people are saying that this is a graveyard for Ukrainian armoured vehicles. Now, that may very well be true, and as I said, there is now abundant film and photographic evidence which appears to confirm it. What I would say, though, is that if this is true, then for unknown reasons, for some unknown reason, the Russian Defense Ministry is downplaying the effect of what they're doing in the Volchansk area. Because though the Russian Defense Ministry does report equipment losses suffered by Ukraine in the Volchansk area, I don't think they come anywhere remotely close to matching some of the claims that have been made. Personnel losses, Ukrainian personnel losses, by contrast, in the Volchansk area, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, have been creeping up steadily, and there is, of course, now a consistent reporting of large numbers of Ukrainian artillery systems, which are also being destroyed by the Russians in the Volchansk area. Anyway, Volchansk, that's the situation there. I personally think that it may take some time, that the Ukrainian troops in this citadel area are effectively trapped. The Russians appear to be in full control. They clearly control the skies above Volchansk, perhaps the supply roads as well. Apparently the bridges across the Volcha River have been destroyed. And yes, it may be a relatively small river, but you can't send large numbers of supplies to an isolated garrison in a zone where endless fighting and bombing is taking place across a river barrier, however limited that is. So those troops are clearly surrounded, or so it seems to me. Probably the Russians have broken into the citadel. There's undoubtedly still a lot of fighting to do. The very fact that these troops, Ukrainian troops, are surrounded by definition means they have nowhere to retreat to, and that may be stiffening their resistance. But sooner or later, Ukrainian resistance will break, and the Russians will gain control, first of the north of Volchansk, and then of the rest of it. Now, there's also been lots of reports about the Russians continuing to capture various villages south of Kupiansk. It does seem to me that one way or the other, the Russians are preparing for some major advance on Kupiansk, which is connected eventually to the battle in Volchansk. However, this still clearly has some way to go, and we'll have to see. I have lost track of the various villages that the Russians have captured in the Kupiansk area or on the process of attacking. Suffice to say that the Russians are on the initiative, are on the roll in this area too. The heaviest fighting of all, I've suggested for several weeks now, is taking place in Chasov Yar. There continues to be intense fighting in the micro district. Now, about 3 weeks ago, there was a report that the Russians, that a unit of Russian paratroopers had crossed to the Ukrainian side of the aqueduct, to the western part of the aqueduct, and had entrenched themselves in the area of the Novi micro district, which is in the southern part of Chasov Yar. And I've seen suggestions, by the way, that this is an area which could be difficult to capture. There are apparently high-rise buildings there. And anyway, we'll see. Now, because we haven't been hearing, or rather getting, pictures or films about the presence of these troops, these Russian troops, west of the canal in this area, there's been some suggestions either that this attack never happened or that the Russians were pushed back. But anyway, over the last 2 days, we've been getting more reports that the Russians are still there. Some are suggesting that they've returned, but I don't see why one should assume that. Anyway, that those Russians are still there, that in fact they've been significantly reinforced, and that they are enlarging their bridgehead west of the aqueduct. And also, yesterday we got further news that the Russians are continuing their advance through Kalinivka, the village to the northwest of Chasov Yar, and that they're edging closer to the aqueduct there as well. There is still a long battle ahead in Chasov Yar. The Ukrainians are defending as intensely as they can with the limited resources that they have. The Russian Air Force in this area is incredibly active, but we can see that the pincers are starting to appear. The Russians advancing to the south, southern flank of Chasov Yar, the Russians advancing to the northern flank of Chasov Yar. I suspect the decisive battle is the one is going to be the one for the micro district east of the aqueduct. Once that falls, the Russians will be in a position to take Chasov Yar from three sides. They'll be able also increasingly to shell and bomb supply routes along the roads leading into Chasov Yar. And I would not be surprised if at some point, maybe in July or August, we see a collapse in Chasov Yar, not that different from the one we saw in February in Avdiivka. But anyway, there is still some way to go. There is lots of news also from the Ocheretino area, the Avdiivka-Ocheretino area. The Russians appear to be gaining more territory in Novo-Alexandrovka, the village to the northwest of Ocheretino, which brings the Russians closer to the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka highway, one of the major supply routes used apparently by the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. Anyway, the Russians are apparently making significant progress now in Novo-Alexandrovka. I'm seeing reports that most of the Ukrainian troops in this area are now recently enlisted conscripts with inadequate training. They're not the same men as Ukraine fought the battle for Avdiivka with. Most of those have now been redeployed apparently to Kharkiv. So probably this explains why the Russians are advancing as steadily as they are. And elsewhere, further south, it seems that the Russians are now making significant headway in Karlovka. There are quite a few reports that suggest that they've actually broken into this village to the west of Netalevo, that they're now advancing not only on both sides of the reservoir, but that they're clearing fields south of Karlovka with a view to bypassing the reservoir and the various water barriers in this area and taking the remaining Ukrainian troops that are trying to hold out in Karlovka in some sort of semicircle. I would say that Redovka, again, had a very interesting discussion and analysis, and so that the most important battles in the Avdiivka-Ocheretino area are no longer the ones in the north, in the area like Novo-Alexandrovka, though that is an important battle, but that the most important battles now are the ones further south in the Netalevo area. With Netalevo captured, and especially if Karlovka is captured, then Ukrainian positions in this area will start to collapse all over again. The water barrier that exists, this network of reservoirs and rivers that runs through Karlovka and other places, will then be behind the Russians, and there is no real barrier then lying in the way of a further advance to places like Pokrovsk, which is one of the major Ukrainian logistical centers, perhaps even the major Ukrainian logistical center throughout Donbass. An interesting analysis. Anyway, we'll see more about it. There's been less news from Krasnogorovka recently. I get the sense that the number of Russian troops in this area is not huge. The Russians do control, from what I can see, most of Krasnogorovka. The Ukrainians remain entrenched in the northwest area, though the Russians are eating away at their positions. They've, as I said yesterday, now captured the city hall and apparently have raised their flag over it. Likely they will finish the battle of Krasnogorovka when the moment comes. Perhaps they're waiting, perhaps they're focusing at the moment on the more important battle for Karlovka further north, who's to say? As I said, I'm not a tactician. Krasnogorovka's fate, however, is in effect already sealed. I don't think anybody disputes this. If all of these places fall, as I said, the Russians well on their way to advancing further towards Kurachovo and all of those places as well. And in that case, the whole Ukrainian positions in southern Donbass, including in Vuhledar further south, would start to collapse. And elsewhere, a Russian official, our old friend Vladimir Rogov, tells us that Staromayorsk is now, in the Vremivka salient, is now almost completely under Russian control. This is how he's reported to be commenting about this by TASS. He says that the liberation of Staromayorsk and, to a lesser degree, Orozhainoye is progressing. Assault force groups are following motorcycle units, and now heavy armor, including tanks, have emerged and are delivering fire inside the communities in that direction. Now we can say that the larger part of Staromayorsk is under our control, and our fighters keep exploiting their success. It's perhaps a symbolic battle rather than a strategic one, at least I assume so. But anyway, given that the capture of Staromayorsk and Orozhainoye was a huge objective for the Ukrainians, the loss of these places will be a devastating blow, presumably to the Ukrainians and to their overall morale. Lastly, there are lots of reports of further Russian advances in the Zaporozhye area to outflanking the Ukrainian troops in the fields near Rabotino. Supposedly, Ukrainian losses in this area are now increasing now that they've been pushed into the fields and no longer have even largely demolished buildings to rely upon as cover. And there's also claims that the Russians are now quietly recapturing all the various islands in the Dnieper River, several of which had been captured by the Ukrainians in conjunction with their Krinky operation. And anyway, there's also some suggestions, I discussed them some time ago, that the Russians might be considering crossing the Dnieper themselves and returning to Kherson region, though whether they will do that remains to be seen. If they do that, by the way, it will be an enormous shock in Ukraine. So, very bad situation on the battlefronts. Now, Ukraine is not the only conflict in the world. Looming behind Ukraine and heavily influenced by it, there is the gathering crisis in the relations between the United States and China. And the Chinese and US defense ministers recently had a meeting. Chinese Defense Minister Dong Zun and US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin had a face-to-face meeting on Friday, yesterday, on the sidelines of the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore. And the Chinese media are pointing out that this is the first meeting that has taken place between the defense ministers of China and the United States since November 2022. Now, as is often the way, Chinese media accounts of this meeting give an initial impression that the meeting went relatively well, and then we go into the details of the readouts, and it turns out that, on the contrary, the meeting appears to have gone extremely badly, or at least was extremely tense, with the Chinese talking to the Americans about firm stances. And this is part of the readout that the Chinese have produced, as reproduced by Global Times. Dong and Austin's meeting comes after large-scale exercises by the People's Liberation Army to deter Taiwan independence secessionist forces following Taiwan regional leader Lai Ching-te's May 20th separatist inaugural speech, and also takes place amid escalating tensions in the South China Sea, resulting from the Philippines' provocative moves over Chinese islands and reefs. And I've discussed in recent programs how the Wall Street Journal has been reporting American military exercises on some of these islands, Philippine islands, I should say, these islands that are claimed by the Philippines. And some of these apparently are within actual visual sight of Taiwan itself. And then we're told by the Chinese that at the meeting, Dong expressed China's firm stance on the Taiwan question. Regarding the United States congratulating Lai on his inauguration, the word inauguration is in inverted commas, and sending a delegation to attend the inauguration ceremony, that is also in inverted commas, Dong stated that the Taiwan question is purely China's internal affair and external forces have no right to interfere. The US actions seriously violated the One China principle and the Three China-US joint communiques and went against the commitments it has made, sending a wrong signal to the Taiwan independence secessionist forces, which China firmly opposes, Dong told Austin. Dong urged the United States to correct its mistakes, adhere to the One China principle, and not in any way assist independence, again in quotation marks, through military means. And then a Chinese military commentator told Global Times, this is Lieutenant General He Lei, that the Taiwan question is the core of Chinese core interests, the political foundation, and the fundamental principle upon which China establishes diplomatic relations with countries around the world. It is the first red line that cannot be crossed in China-US relations, and any actions that undermine this core, shake the foundation, or cross the red line, which will be firmly opposed and resolutely countered by the Chinese people and the Chinese government, He Lei said, noting that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has the unwavering determination, strong will, and formidable capability to resolutely safeguard national sovereignty, security, territorial integrity, and the unity of the motherland. On the South China Sea issue, Dong said to Austin that currently the Philippines has acted treacherously and provocatively on issues such as the Genai Tiao or Genai Reef, which is closely related to the instigation and support from external forces, which is, of course, means the United States. And then we go on to read, in particular, the United States has deployed mid-range missiles, ATACMS missiles, in other words, in the Philippines under the guise of military exercises, posing a substantial threat to regional security, a move strongly opposed by China, Dong said. China insists on resolving differences through equal consultations, whilst adhering to commitments, but will not tolerate actions that escalate provocations, said the Chinese defense minister. It reads as if this was an extremely touchy meeting, with the Chinese effectively throwing the book at the Americans. the and again, since there is not going to be any change in US policy on this question, on the contrary, the drift towards supporting Taiwanese independence in the United States seems to me immovable. It's impossible to avoid the conclusion that a crisis with a very high prospect of an armed clash is just around the corner. And that probably explains another comment that the Chinese defense minister has apparently said. Now, I haven't read the comment myself, but apparently he has spoken about China and Russia, the Chinese and Russian militaries, acting together to ensure world peace and stability and independence and to combat hegemony. It looks as if the Chinese and the Russians are starting to make common ground. They're not just strategic partners, in other words, but they're strategic partners which see themselves challenged in the most fundamental and existential way by the same adversary, which is to say by the United States. If the United States wants to create an alliance between China and Russia, then it is going the right way about it by needlessly stoking up these tensions in Taiwan, just as it continues to stoke up tensions in Ukraine. And once more, this doesn't seem to be reversible. The US is now telling the Europeans to tighten up their trade with China so that China doesn't export dual-use technologies and other things to Russia, to assist Russia with its conduct of the special military operation. This is a bizarre proposal. It shows a fundamental failure to understand the true balance of industrial, manufacturing, and technological power in the world, which does not favor the United States or its allies anymore. But there we are. The war in Ukraine, terrifying and horrible as it is, I suspect, only the overture to the great act which is to come. The battle in the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea and the blockade the United States is going to impose on China, which I'm sorry to say, I now firmly expect to happen at some point over the next few years. Well, this is where I finish my program today. I've not said anything at all in any of these programs about recent events in the United States and specifically in New York. I presumably will do so in my next program. In the meantime, until then, all that remains is for me to wish you a very good day and also to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X, and also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by checking out our shop. Please remember to take the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Long video today. Thank you again very much. More from me soon, and have a very good day.